There are villages in the borderlands where the wind itself seems to remember, where every chapel bell and crack of timber carries the echo of some older faith, half Christian, half pagan. Among such mists lies Llwynarth, a place whispered about in the taverns of Wales and spoken of in London only by those who knew Holmes and me in our darker hours. It was there that a ritual older than the Reformation took on flesh and consequence, a rite by which a man, called the Sin Eater, was paid to take upon himself the guilt of the dead. Bread, salt, and ale upon a corpse's breast, a few muttered words, and the living believed themselves cleansed. But in the autumn of 1889, that ancient superstition turned to murder. A colonel's sudden death, a stranger found lifeless in a loft, and the whisper of a curse that crept through every corridor of a lonely Welsh manor. When the vicar came to Baker Street, pale and trembling with talk of a house that eats its own sins, Holmes merely smiled, that thin, knowing smile I have come to dread, and said, "Watson, pack your revolver. We dine tonight in the house of the dead." What we found there was no haunting, but a crime conceived in secrecy, cloaked in faith, and sealed with poison. This, then, is the tale I have come to call Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Sin Eater's House. You're listening to Detective Street, where untold mysteries find their voice. And if you enjoy this story, consider subscribing, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Chapter 1. A Caller in the Fog. It was a quiet morning at Baker Street, the sort of pale London forenoon when a dull fire shows scarlet in the grate and the street cries are flattened by the mist into melancholy notes. The crossing sweepers' brooms made soft, rhythmic whispers against the cobblestones below, and somewhere in the grey distance a barrel organ played a tune that seemed to dissolve into the fog before it could quite reach our windows. Holmes had completed an experiment which left a crystalline bloom upon our breakfast plates, a result he declared suggestive but inconclusive, and was relapsing into his violin when Mrs. Hudson announced a clergyman. I observed my friend's long, pale fingers pause upon the bow, his grey eyes flickering with that peculiar intensity that signalled the arrival of something that might relieve the terrible ennui which had afflicted him these past weeks. The Reverend Daniel Meredith of Llanryd Parish stood upon our hearthrug, cap in hand, rein in the hem of his cassock, and worry scored upon an honest brow. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the spare frame of one who walks his parish on foot, and the calloused hands of a man who does not merely preach labour, but practices it. He spoke in that musical cadence I have often noticed west of the marches, each vowel rounded and given its full measure. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, his eyes moving from my friend to myself, and back again, as if seeking confirmation of tales he had heard. "They tell me you do not make light of country notions, however strange." "On the contrary," Holmes returned, steepling his fingers before his aquiline nose. "I am a connoisseur of strange notions. The strangest cases have often the simplest explanations, while the apparently simple may conceal labyrinths. Pray be seated, Reverend. You have come from the border counties. Your boots carry the reddish gravel of the Clun Valley, and the faint odour of peat shows you crossed moorland this morning, or else travelled in a conveyance that did. The moisture pattern upon your cassock suggests you walked the last mile from the station in heavy fog. What burden have you brought from them?" The clergyman sank into the basket chair, his weathered face showing that mixture of relief and apprehension I had witnessed in so many of Holmes's clients. He removed his spectacles, polished them with a handkerchief that bore the neat darning of a bachelor's housekeeper, and replaced them with fingers that trembled slightly. "It is the house of Archer. Llwynarth, we call it in the Welsh," said he. "A matter most strange, Mr. Holmes, and one that touches upon practices I had thought extinct outside the darkest corners of folklore. Colonel Henry Archer, late of the Indian Staff Corps, died in his chair last week. Our village doctor named it the heart, an apoplexy, or perhaps a weakness long concealed. Yet at the wake, the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Price, who has served the family these 30 years, insisted upon the old rite." Holmes leaned forward, the violin forgotten upon his knee. "The old rite." Bread and salt set upon the colonel's breast, the clergyman continued, his voice dropping as though the words themselves carried weight. "A cup of ale by the candle, and a man to take them and eat. God forgive us, so that the sins of the dead be not laid upon the living. They call him a sin-eater, Mr. Holmes. I had read of such things in antiquarian journals, but never thought to see the practice performed in my own parish." I confess a chill ran through me at these words, though the fire burned brightly enough. Holmes's eyes, however, had narrowed with that swift inner light I had seen when a case first touched the flint of his mind. "And the man?" he asked, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "A stranger, ragged, bearded, speaking little. He called himself Reese Pritchard, a common enough name in those parts. He ate the bread, drank from the cup, pocketed the coins Mrs. Price offered him, and went his way into the dusk. We thought that the end of it, however distasteful. 2 days later, we found him dead in the loft of an unused cottage on the Archer land, his body already cold. Yesterday morning, the estate steward, Owen Hughes, a steady man, Mr. Holmes, not given to drink or fancy, fell from those same stairs. He was found with his neck broken at the foot of the ladder. The villagers whisper the curse has begun, that the sins have come home to roost." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, his dressing gown swirling about his lean frame. He stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the grey fog, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice carried that note of controlled excitement that I knew well. "And you do not whisper it, Reverend. You believe something else." "I do," the poor man admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "The colonel wrote to me the day before his death, a brief note asking to speak of a matter of conscience. When I came the following afternoon, summoned by his niece, he was beyond speech forever. Now his sin-eater is dead, and another man with him. I fear sin of the living more than of the dead, Mr. Holmes. I fear that superstition has been made a cloak for murder." Holmes turned from the window, and I saw upon his face that look of fierce concentration that transformed him from the languid bohemian into the keenest reasoning machine in Europe. He drew toward him not a letter, for none had been produced, but rather fixed his gaze upon the vicar's anxious face, reading there all that remained unspoken. "You shall have from me," said he, "what truth can be found in the company of fog. Watson, your medical bag, and your service revolver, I think. Mrs. Hudson, our capes and travelling bags. We may be gone some days. Reverend Meredith, we shall dine tonight, if Providence allows, in your sin-eater's house." Within the hour we had departed Baker Street, the vicar's hack waiting below in the swirling mist. As our cab rattled through the grey streets toward Paddington Station, I watched Holmes's profile against the window. His fingers moved slightly, as if playing upon invisible violin strings, and I knew that already he was arranging the facts into their proper sequence, testing hypotheses, discarding impossibilities. The journey westward took us through country that grew progressively wilder and more remote. The autumn fog that had embraced London gave way to a thin, cold rain that beaded upon the carriage windows. We changed trains at Shrewsbury, where the station clock struck 3 with a deep, sonorous note that seemed to hang in the damp air. Holmes spoke little, smoking pipe after pipe of his strongest shag tobacco, while the Reverend Meredith dozed fitfully in his corner. As evening approached, we hired a trap for the final miles to Llwynarth. The landscape had grown harsh and beautiful, rolling moorland studded with ancient oaks, their branches black against a sky the colour of pewter. Stone walls divided the fields, and here and there a farmhouse showed a welcoming light. But as we descended into the river valley where Llwynarth stood, the light seemed to fail more quickly, and the shadows gathered with an eagerness that made me grip my stick more firmly. Thus began our journey toward the border and into a household where superstition and calculation had settled in like twin ravens upon the same beam. The day seemed to darken in anticipation of what we should find, and I could not shake the feeling that we were descending not merely into a valley, but into something older and darker than the rational world I knew. Chapter 2. First shadows at Llwynarth. Llwynarth stood upon a slope above its little river, a handsome, square house built in the Georgian style, with a pedimented porch, its stone blackened by a century of weather, and its windows not so much reflecting the grey twilight as swallowing it whole. There is a silence peculiar to country houses when death has lately passed. It hung here like a veil, broken only by the distant sound of water running over stones and the harsh cry of a raven settling in the yew trees that bordered the drive. We were received at the door by a manservant whose face bore that carefully neutral expression of the well-trained domestic who has seen much and will speak little. The entrance hall was oak-panelled and dim, with ancestral portraits staring down from walls that had absorbed decades of lamp smoke. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner with that peculiar slowness that makes one conscious of every passing second. The principal rooms bore the impersonal neatness of the well-managed English house. Only the Colonel's study had that clutter I love in a room with a mind in it. Here were the accumulated passions of a lifetime. Insect cases upon the walls, their specimens pinned with the precision of a man who valued order. Specimen jars filled with creatures preserved in spirits, a brass microscope of excellent manufacture, a tray of pins for lepidoptery arranged by gauge, and, set upon the mantelpiece, with casual disregard for its deadly nature, a tin of potassium cyanide, such as naturalists use to charge their killing bottles. The hearth was swept clean, yet a fringe of soot traced the window latch, as though some short, fierce burning had lately sucked the draught another way. Holmes's gaze took all this in with his usual rapidity. The scattered papers, the dust patterns upon the desk, the faint discoloration upon the Persian carpet, where a heavy object had long rested and been recently removed, and then, without appearing to do so, fixed upon the housekeeper who had entered to offer us refreshment. Mrs. Price was a capable Welshwoman of perhaps 55 years, with steady grey eyes, strong, capable hands, and the upright carriage of one accustomed to authority within her domain. She wore the black bombazine of mourning, but her apron was the practical blue calico of daily work. Upon the index finger of her right hand, I observed the faint yellow stain that belongs less to the scullery than to the hedgerow, the mark, as I had learned in my practice, of one who handles certain plants with frequency. Her devotion to her late master she proclaimed in a severity of manner toward all others, speaking in short, clipped sentences, and watching us with the wariness of a shepherd who has spotted wolves upon the hill. Miss Margaret Archer, the Colonel's orphaned niece and sole relative, received us in the drawing-room with a quiet dignity that spoke well of her character. She was, perhaps, 28, with the dark hair and clear complexion of Welsh ancestry, and eyes reddened by vigil rather than excessive weeping. She wore no mourning ornament beyond a plain jet cross at her throat. When she spoke, her voice was low and controlled, though I detected beneath it the strain of recent shocks. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you are most kind to come. My uncle spoke of you, Mr. Holmes, though I do not think you ever met. He followed your cases in the newspapers, and often said that you represented the triumph of reason over superstition. I think he would have approved of your presence here, though I confess I hardly know what to tell you. My uncle died peacefully in his chair. The doctor assured me it was natural, yet now 2 more men are dead, and the servants whisper of curses. Tell me about your uncle's habits in his final days," Holmes requested, settling into a chair with that peculiar stillness he assumed when gathering information. "His health, his temperament, any visitors he may have received." Miss Archer composed herself, her hands folded in her lap. "My uncle had been in excellent spirits, Mr. Holmes. He had complained occasionally of palpitations. He was past 60, and had served many years in India, which takes its toll. But he walked daily, took an interest in his natural history collections, and was planning a paper on the moths of the border counties. On the day of his death, he wrote to Reverend Meredith. I found the letter in his desk afterward, sealed, but not yet posted. He asked for a private interview on a matter of conscience. That evening, after dinner, he retired to his study, as usual. I heard no sound of distress. When I looked in before retiring, he appeared to be sleeping in his chair, his glass beside him. In the morning, Mrs. Price found him cold. "The glass?" Holmes inquired sharply. It had contained brandy, I believe, his usual evening cordial. Mrs. Price had cleared it away before I rose. Holmes's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "And the sin-eating ceremony? You consented to it?" A flush rose to Miss Archer's pale cheeks. "I did not, Mr. Holmes. I am ashamed to say that my household did it while I slept, exhausted from the vigil. I woke to find it done. Mrs. Price insisted it was a kindness no Archer had refused in living memory, that the old ways have power and must be respected." At this moment, the housekeeper herself appeared in the doorway. "The old ways do have power, miss," she said, her voice firm. "Your great-grandfather and your grandfather both had the rite performed. It would have been a sin to leave the Colonel without it." "Power," Holmes repeated softly, as if turning a coin over in his mind. "Where does it lie, I wonder, Mrs. Price? In the bread, the salt, or the hand that lays them? And who suggested that this particular stranger be summoned?" "He came of his own accord, sir," Mrs. Price replied, meeting Holmes's gaze without flinching. "I opened the kitchen door at dusk, and there he stood. I took it for a sign. "Signs are remarkably accommodating," Holmes murmured. "They appear precisely when wanted, and in exactly the expected form. Dr. Vaughan, is he in the house?" Dr. Vaughan, the village practitioner, arrived shortly thereafter, summoned from his rounds. He was a florid man of middle age, careful in speech, with that slightly defensive manner of the country physician who has learned to distrust the opinions of London specialists. His bag was worn but well kept, and his hands showed the steadiness of long practice. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, nodding to each of us. "The Colonel's death was unfortunate, but not unexpected. He had complained of palpitations on several occasions. I had counselled rest and a reduction of stimulants. He was found in his chair, glass in hand, apparently having suffered a cardiac seizure. It is a mercy, gentlemen, when the great engine stops at once rather than grinding slowly to its halt." "You examined the body?" Holmes asked. "I did, sir. There were no signs of violence, no external marks. The face showed the slight cyanosis one might expect in sudden heart failure. I signed the certificate without hesitation." "And the glass? You examined its contents?" A slight hesitation. "The glass had been cleared away, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Price, in her distress, had already cleaned the study. I saw no reason to question it." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the darkening grounds. "And the sin-eater's death. What did you make of that?" Dr. Vaughan shifted his weight. "A wretched business. The man was known to be a habitual drinker. I suppose he found some bottle in that loft and wished to make more of the Archer wake than custom allowed. Or perhaps, in his condition, the climb itself overtaxed his heart." "You detected no signs of poisoning?" Another pause, longer this time. "I did not perform a thorough examination, Mr. Holmes. The body had lain undiscovered for 2 days in cold weather. The features were not pleasant." "But you smelled nothing unusual? Nothing, say, of almonds?" The doctor's florid face paled slightly. "I cannot say I gave particular attention to odours, Mr. Holmes. The circumstances were hardly conducive to close investigation." Holmes turned from the window, and I saw that look in his eyes that meant he had scented the trail. "Perhaps, Dr. Vaughan, we might remedy that omission. With Miss Archer's permission, I should like to see the cottage where the sin-eater was found." We went by a footpath through dripping yew and beech, the dusk gathering like smoke between the trees. The cottage was a low, whitewashed building whose door hung crooked on rusted hinges, squealing as we pushed it open. The interior smelled of damp stone, old straw, and beneath it all, that peculiarly sweet, breath-catching taint I have smelled twice in my life, and never forgotten. Once in a medical lecture on poisons, once in the mortuary after a suicide. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" asked Holmes softly, his hand upon my arm. "Bitter almonds," I replied, my professional training overcoming my revulsion. "Faint, but unmistakable." "Cyanide," he confirmed, almost tenderly, as one might name an old acquaintance, though the draught of years in this place might disguise most anything to a less attentive nose. The loft above was accessible only by a crude ladder. Holmes ascended first, moving with that peculiar grace of his that seemed almost feline. I followed, my medical bag slung over my shoulder, and found myself in a low space with a straw palliasse in one corner, and upon a rough shelf what appeared to be a makeshift altar of sorts, a clay cup of crude village manufacture, a crust of bread now mouldy, and 3 bright pennies laid side by side with ritualistic precision. Holmes lifted the clay cup with his handkerchief, holding it to the light that filtered through gaps in the tiles. He indicated a minute blue-white bloom upon the rim, delicate as hoar-frost, visible only at a certain angle. "Our sin-eater drank," he said. "Whether of sin or of another's cup, we shall learn. But someone prepared this for him with considerable care. Observe, Watson. The cup is not of the house. It is village pottery, the sort sold at market fairs. The crust is from a common loaf. But the pennies—" He lifted one delicately. "These are of a particular minting, 2 years shy of common circulation here. Someone planned this ceremony with some attention to detail, yet made certain errors that betrayed haste or ignorance." I examined the ladder more closely, my medical training directing my attention to the marks upon it. Near the top, I found a scuffed mark that might have been made by a heel sliding in panic or sudden weakness. Holmes, on his knees in the dust, examined a smear upon the ladder's side. He touched it with one long finger, smelled it, and smiled without mirth. "Beeswax and soot," he announced. "Someone carried something newly charred and newly polished up or down this ladder. The combination is too domestic to be romantic, Watson. It speaks of household management rather than rustic ceremony." He straightened, brushing dust from his trousers, and looked toward the main house, now barely visible through the gathering gloom. "Reverend, who specifically summoned the stranger?" "Mrs. Price told me the man had come to the back door before dusk," said Meredith, who had waited below, clearly uncomfortable in this place of death. "She took it for a sign, as I said." "Signs are too easily arranged," Holmes murmured, his eyes distant with calculation. "They require only opportunity, motive, and a certain ruthlessness of character." We walked back by another way, crossing the stable yard where the evening mist was rising from the cobblestones. Holmes paused, bent, and lifted from the mire a single coarse blue thread caught upon a projecting nail-head. He slipped it into his pocketbook without comment, but I saw his lips tighten with satisfaction. As we reached the house, the lamps were being lit within, throwing warm rectangles of light across the darkening grounds. Holmes asked that the staff and residents be kind enough to remain within the house that evening, and that no one venture to the cottage or the outbuildings. Miss Archer agreed with visible relief, while Mrs. Price's face showed a momentary flash of something that might have been fear before settling back into its customary severity. It was not fear that gnawed at me then, as we stood in the gathering darkness, but the old soldier's sense that the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The facts, such as we had them, were innocent as bricks, yet Holmes already seemed to feel the shape of their wall, and I knew from long experience that when Holmes began to see the pattern, the revelation would follow with inexorable logic. Chapter 3. Beneath the Ravenseye, we kept our vigil in the Colonel's study, a pair of candles burning without mercy upon the insect boards, their light throwing the pinned specimens into sharp relief. Moths and butterflies arrested in eternal flight, each labelled in the Colonel's precise hand. A kettle sang with maddening cheerfulness upon a spirit lamp, and outside the window the darkness pressed close, broken only by the occasional cry of an owl hunting across the moor. Holmes had settled into the Colonel's own chair, his pipe tracing faint hieroglyphs in the air, which my imagination was only too ready to read as ominous. The room seemed to breathe with us, its shadows shifting with each flicker of flame, the grandfather clock in the hall, counting our vigil second by second. "We have, Watson," said he, breaking a silence that had stretched for perhaps 20 minutes. "3 deaths, or near enough. The colonel, whose cup was not examined, and whose body was consigned to earth this morning with indecent haste, the sin-eater, whose cup bears the unmistakable smile of cyanide upon its rim, and Owen Hughes, whose fall had no witness save the morning that found him. Add to these," he touched the cyanide tin upon the mantelpiece with the tip of his pipe, "the means at hand, the superstition at handier still, and the hand which we must presently take." "You believe Mrs. Price is the hand?" I asked quietly. "I believe Mrs. Price has hands that know certain plants and certain purposes," Holmes replied, "but belief is not evidence, and evidence is what we must have before we can speak." The yellow stain upon her finger suggests digitalis, foxglove, as the common folk call it, a dangerous cardiac stimulant in small doses, a deadly poison in larger ones. Yet our sin-eater died of cyanide, which is not the weapon of the hedgerow, but of the laboratory. Someone in this house had access to both. The vicar, decent man that he was, dozed and started by turns in his chair by the fire, his chin dropping to his chest, and then jerking up as some dream disturbed him. Miss Archer came once to ask if we required anything, bringing tea on a tray with her own hands, and would have withdrawn had Holmes not detained her with a gesture. "Your uncle's affairs?" he asked, his voice gentle but his eyes keen. "His will, his intentions, were these settled?" She set down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. "They were orderly, Mr. Holmes, as one would expect from a military man. He was generous to the village. He had endowed the school and contributed to the church restoration. But he was strict in the house. He had lately quarrelled with Mrs. Price about money advanced to her brother. A wastrel, I'm afraid, who drinks what he earns and borrows what he cannot. My uncle had refused further assistance. He had also spoken of altering his will. I had begged him to do what was just, for Mrs. Price has served faithfully for 30 years, and deserved better than to be turned off in her old age. We were to speak of it the very evening he died. He was in good spirits that evening. Excellent spirits, Mr. Holmes. He had been working on his collection, mounting a rare moth he had taken near the river. He dined well, took his brandy, and seemed content. When I found him the next morning, there was almost a smile upon his face. Holmes nodded slowly. "And the letter he wrote to Reverend Meredith. You read it?" "I did not, sir. It was sealed. I placed it in the coffin with him, as I thought he would have wished." A shadow crossed Holmes's face. "A pity. That letter might have told us much." Dr. Vaughan, when he came on his evening rounds, for he had taken lodgings at the inn and was attending Miss Archer for her nerves, lifted the kettle lid as if to remind us that earthly comforts were not to be despised, even in the theatre of crime. The steam rose and vanished, and in its wake I caught a faint medicinal odour. "The sin-eater's death is a wretched business," he said, pouring himself tea with a physician's automatic precision. "The man was a habitual drinker, as I mentioned. I suppose he found some bottle in that loft, and wished to make more of the Archer wake than it deserved. These professional mourners are often thus." "Professional mourners?" Holmes echoed. Then Pritchard was known in the district. "Known to move between parishes when there was a death and coin to be had," the doctor replied. "I cannot say I approved of the practice, but the common folk cling to their superstitions with remarkable tenacity. The cup we found was not an archer cup, Holmes observed, his eyes hooded. It was a village clay, crude work, likely purchased at market. Does that not suggest premeditation rather than opportunistic drinking? Then your culprit is the village, the doctor returned, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. Holmes's answering smile was rarer and colder than any I have captured in my pages. Villages do not measure poison by grains, Doctor. Villagers do not understand the properties of potassium cyanide or its minimum lethal dose. But a man of science does. Or should. The doctor's florid face darkened. If you are suggesting, I am suggesting nothing yet, Holmes interrupted smoothly. I am merely observing that when a man dies with the odour of bitter almonds upon his breath, and a physician examines the body and smells nothing, one must wonder whether the failing lies in the nose or in the willingness of that nose to perceive. An uncomfortable silence fell. The doctor finished his tea with jerky movements and departed with barely civil goodbyes. The vicar stirred in his sleep and muttered something about ravens. Outside, the wind had risen, moaning in the eaves and rattling the window frames. Later, when the house was quiet and the servants had retired, Holmes took one of the candles and, with me at his heels, made a minute survey of the study. His magnifying glass came out, and he moved about the room like a hunting dog quartering a field, examining surfaces that appeared to my eye perfectly innocent. His eye went at once to the window latch with its peculiar soot fringe. He placed his palm near the hearthstones, and, finding them cool despite the fire that had burned earlier, opened the ash drawer beneath the grate. There lay a fine, greasy black residue which clung to his glove when he touched it and shone in the candlelight with an oily iridescence. Fat-charged soot, he said, speaking as much to himself as to me. Not the fine ash of coal burning steadily for hours, Watson, but the fierce, brief consumption of something else. Paper, perhaps, but paper coated with wax to make it burn completely and quickly. Observe the faint ring upon the desk. He directed my attention to a circular mark, barely visible, upon the leather surface. The mark of a seal impressed while the wax was warm and then torn away in haste. Observe also the remnants of sealing wax in the groove here, and the shape of the impression. No signet, but the blunt oval of something makeshift. Who, in a household, would seal with such a tool? A thimble, I said, understanding dawning. Mrs. Price would have one. He nodded with satisfaction. And who would burn a sealed paper in this grate, with the window cracked to draw the smoke away quickly and wipe the latch afterward in haste, leaving this telltale smear? Before I could answer, there came from the corridor beyond the study a soft metallic click, distinct in the midnight stillness, and then, as if from the far side of the house, a single bell rang once and fell silent. I own that it chilled me, for there was something of the old nursery tales in that solitary chime echoing through the sleeping house. Holmes set his candle down with careful precision and went out like a cat, his tread making no noise upon the carpet. I followed, my hand instinctively seeking my revolver pocket. The bell rope in the corridor hung still as a plumb line, its tassel unstirred by any breeze. A draught kissed my cheek, cold and damp. The door to the service stair stood ajar, though I could have sworn it had been shut when we passed earlier. From below came the faintest scrape, as of a shoe upon stone, and then silence. Holmes descended the narrow stair with that peculiar flowing movement of his, and I followed, my heart beating rather faster than I cared to admit. We emerged into the kitchen passage, where the banked fire in the range cast a red glow upon copper pots. The back door stood closed, its bolt drawn. Holmes examined it, then moved to the window, where he found what he sought. A length of fine cord, its end knotted about a bent pin, running along the skirting and out through a ventilation grate. He returned with the cord in his hand, his face showing grim amusement. "A childish trick," he said, "but effective for its purpose. This cord runs beneath the skirting, out through the vent, and is tied, or was until I cut it, to the stable door. A man pulling the stable door from without sets a bell chiming within. It would serve to draw people one way, while a friend moved another, or to test whether we were alert or sleeping." "Someone is watching us," I said. "Someone is frightened," Holmes corrected. "And frightened people make mistakes. We shall let them believe their trick succeeded." He replaced the cut cord carefully where he had found it, and, to my astonishment, settled himself to sleep upon the Colonel's leather couch with the ease of a soldier in bivouac. "We shall need our wits for tomorrow, Watson. At dawn, we visit the Sin-Eater's house again. At noon, we gather the living. At evening, we speak for the dead." I sat my watch with the vicar's gentle snore for company, while the house creaked and settled around us like a ship at anchor. The grandfather clock in the hall struck the hours with sonorous dignity. 1, 2, 3. I have seldom felt time move with such caution, as if it feared the thing on the path ahead, and would not meet it until Holmes was ready. Chapter 4. Holmes at the threshold, dawn, found the fields shining with a frost that turned every hedge to silver, and made the spider-webs into nets of diamonds. The raven I had heard the previous evening sat in the highest yew, watching our movements with round, malevolent eyes as we emerged from the house into air that bit like steel. Holmes, already abroad before I had finished my morning ablutions, returned to us as we breakfasted, with a face which told me that some card had turned up from the deck. His hands were stained with soil, and there were burrs upon his trousers that spoke of crawling through hedgerows. "I have been to the cottage again," said he, accepting coffee from Miss Archer with an absent nod. "And to certain other places besides. Our Sin-Eater's pockets contained 3 pennies of a particular minting, as I mentioned, struck in Birmingham in 1891, 2 years shy of common circulation here. More interesting still, they were wrapped in a strip of blue calico, torn with some force, showing where stitching had given way. The same coarse blue thread we found upon the stable nail will match it exactly, I think. Observe, too, Watson, the Reverend's description." The stranger came to the kitchen door as dusk fell, too clean a timing for a man who lives by chance and wanders as opportunity offers. He was expected, he was summoned, and he was paid with marked coin wrapped in fabric that would lead us, eventually, to its source. Miss Archer had paled. "You mean someone deliberately—" "I mean nothing yet that I can prove," Holmes interrupted gently. "But I should very much like your permission, Miss Archer, to examine the household sewing-room." It was a sunny little place on the upper floor, with a view over the yews to the moorland beyond. A sewing machine stood by the window, and upon the table lay the ordinary impedimenta of domestic needlework: scissors, thread, patterns cut from newspaper. In a wicker basket beneath the table lay a torn blue apron, its hem showing where a section had been ripped away with considerable violence. Upon the table itself sat a thimble, its rim faintly nicked and scored, as if it had been used for purposes other than sewing. Holmes lifted the thimble with his handkerchief, turned it in the morning light streaming through the window, and showed me the marks upon it. "Pressed into warm wax," he said softly, "to make a seal. Not the seal of any official document, but sufficient to secure a paper one wished to seem authentic. The blue apron in the basket matches the thread from the stable nail, and unless I am much mistaken—" He lifted the torn apron, examining the rent. "This was not torn by accident, Watson. Someone pulled it free in haste, perhaps caught upon something, perhaps deliberately torn to wrap the coins she did not wish traced directly to her person." "Mrs. Price," I said. "Mrs. Price," he agreed. "But having her is not the same as proving her guilt, nor understanding her. Motive. For that, we need more." In the afternoon he vanished, and I have come to know that when Holmes goes into the world and does not take me, he goes as another man entirely. Yes, with a stoop in his spine, a shuffle in his gait, and a voice that could belong to anyone from any county. He returned at sunset, smelling faintly of peat smoke and ale, his eyes bright with that satisfaction that comes from a hypothesis confirmed. "The tavern keeper," said he, stripping off the rough coat he had worn over his own, "recalls that Mrs. Price sent word 3 days before the Colonel's death, asking if any knew where Reese Pritchard might be found. Pritchard had once been a gardener at a neighbouring estate, before drink unmade him. He had a sister, dead these 5 years, and a brother who gave him, occasionally, the fear of God and a few coins to move on with. Between the Colonel's death and Pritchard's discovery, Mrs. Price was seen twice near the cottage, once the morning after the sin-eating, carrying a basket which she said contained provisions for the mourners, and once the following evening. The tavern-keeper's wife remarked upon it, for Mrs. Price was not usually given to such charitable errands. "But why kill Pritchard at all?" I asked. "If he had performed his office and departed, surely the danger passed with him." "Ah, Watson, that is the question that opens the lock," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "What if Pritchard saw something during the sin-eating ceremony? What if he noticed something about the Colonel's body, or the room, or the manner of death that made him suspicious? A man who lives by such practices develops a certain expertise in death. He would know the difference between a natural death and one hastily arranged. He came back, I think, not to the cottage first, but to the house itself, seeking to confirm his suspicions, or perhaps to negotiate his silence. And someone who could move freely between house and cottage, someone who had already measured 1 dose of poison and found the courage or desperation to measure another, gave him a cup prepared with cyanide from the Colonel's own stores. And Owen Hughes. Holmes's face darkened. The steward was an honest man, by all accounts. I think he found something. Perhaps the torn apron, perhaps the tin of cyanide showing recent use. Perhaps he saw Mrs. Price near the cottage at a suspicious hour. He went to investigate, and she followed. In the darkness of that loft, with the ladder the only escape, it would take only a moment, a push, a stumble, and the poor man's neck broken at the bottom. Murder compounded upon murder, Watson, each one making the next more necessary and more terrible. We dined quietly that evening, the household assembled in that state of suspended dread that comes when all know something dreadful must soon break, but none know precisely when. Dr. Vaughan had returned, ostensibly to check upon Miss Archer's health, but in truth, I suspected, drawn by that morbid fascination that attends a house of death. Mrs. Price served the meal with her usual efficiency, her face a mask of composure, though I saw her hands tremble slightly as she poured the wine. At noon the following day, Holmes gathered them all in the drawing-room. The vicar, Miss Archer, the doctor, and Mrs. Price, with her hands clenched in her blue apron, the very apron that matched the torn fabric in the sewing basket above. The autumn light fell through the tall windows in shafts of pale gold, illuminating dust motes that drifted like spirits in the still air. The room seemed to lean toward Holmes as he stood at the window, his silhouette cut sharp against the flat winter sky. "The dead speak in the ways permitted them," he began, his voice carrying that peculiar quality of controlled intensity that could hold an audience as surely as a conductor holds an orchestra. "They cannot point to their murderers, cannot testify in courts of law, cannot cry out for justice. But they leave traces, in soot and wax, in the residue of chemicals, in the marks upon ladders, and the threads caught upon nails." The colonel spoke by means of a letter he did not post, and a paper he was tricked into sealing. The sin-eater spoke by a cup bearing the unmistakable trace of poison. Owen Hughes spoke by a heel mark upon a ladder, and the absence of any reason for a careful man to fall. They have said enough, if we will only listen. He turned to face the room, and I saw upon his face that expression of cold certainty that marked the culmination of his cases. The colonel feared something in his final days. He wrote to Reverend Meredith about a matter of conscience. Not his own conscience, I think, but that of another. He had quarrelled with his housekeeper about money advanced to her wastrel brother. He had spoken of altering his will. And then, quite suddenly and conveniently, he died. Mrs. Price's lips moved without sound, forming what might have been a prayer or a curse. Holmes continued, his voice never rising, yet taking all the air in the room. Dr. Vaughan pronounced it heart failure, and so it appeared. But the colonel's heart was stopped, not by age or disease, but by digitalis, foxglove, administered in what he believed to be his evening cordial. A dose carefully measured over days or weeks, building in his system until that final cup stopped his heart as surely as a bullet. The glass was cleared away before examination, because it needed to be cleared away. The body was consigned to earth with indecent haste, because it needed to be buried before questions could be asked. "This is speculation," Dr. Vaughan protested, his florid face now pale. "You cannot prove—" "I can prove," Holmes interrupted, "that a sealed document was burned in the colonel's study. A document sealed not with his signet ring, which hangs even now upon his watch chain in Miss Archer's keeping, but with a thimble. I can prove that the blue thread found upon the stable nail matches the apron worn by Mrs. Price, and that a section of that apron was torn away and used to wrap the coins paid to Reese Pritchard. I can prove that Mrs. Price made inquiries about Pritchard's whereabouts 3 days before the colonel's death, not after, when such inquiries might be innocent, but before, when they speak of premeditation." He crossed to the table where he had laid out the evidence with the care of a prosecutor presenting to a jury. The thread, the torn apron, the cup bearing its blue-white bloom, a sample of the soot from the grate mounted upon a glass slide. "You killed the colonel first, Mrs. Price," Holmes said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet every word fell like a hammer blow. Not with cyanide. Too loud. Too obvious. Too likely to be detected even by our friend, the doctor here. But with foxglove tea, which you had been steeping under the pretense of physic for your own palpitations. The yellow stain upon your finger betrays your familiarity with the plant. You gave the colonel his cordial, as you always did. He trusted you, relied upon you, never suspected that the hand that had served him faithfully for 30 years would be the hand that killed him. Mrs. Price swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair, but her eyes remained fixed upon Holmes with a terrible intensity. You watched him die, Holmes continued, and now there was something almost gentle in his voice, the gentleness of a surgeon who must cut, but wishes he need not. You waited until the house slept, and then you burned the codicil you had tricked him into sealing. A codicil, I think, that altered his will in your favor, or in favor of your brother. You used your own thimble to seal it, pressed into wax you warmed by the fire, and you made it seem official enough to fool a dying man. But once he was dead, that paper became dangerous. It would not withstand legal scrutiny. So you burned it in his grate, cracked the window to draw the smoke, and wiped the latch in haste. But you needed more than that, he went on, pacing now before the window like a barrister before the bench. You needed misdirection. You needed the village to believe in old curses rather than new crimes. So you arranged for the sin-eating ceremony, summoning Reese Pritchard by name, paying him with marked coins, sending him away into the dusk. But Pritchard was not the fool you took him for. He had seen many deaths, and something about the colonel's body. Perhaps the slight cyanosis Dr. Vaughan mentioned, perhaps the smell, perhaps merely the timing, made him suspicious. He came back, didn't he? He came back to the house, or he sent word, or he made it known somehow that he had questions. And you could not afford questions. The room had fallen silent, save for the ticking of the clock and Miss Archer's shallow breathing. The Reverend Meredith had covered his eyes with one hand, his lips moving in silent prayer. You prepared a cup, Holmes said, mixing the cyanide from the colonel's own stores. You had access to his study, to his keys, to all his household. You knew the dose because you had seen him use it to charge his killing bottles for specimens. You took the cup to the cottage, perhaps with food as well, playing the kindly housekeeper concerned for a poor wanderer. Pritchard drank. The poison acts within minutes, convulsions, paralysis, death. He tried to descend the ladder, perhaps to seek help, perhaps simply in the animal panic of a dying creature. He fell or slipped, and you left him there, arranging the scene to look like a drunk man's accident. No, Mrs. Price whispered, the first word she had spoken. No, I did not mean— You did not mean for him to suffer, Holmes said, and his voice was not unkind. I believe that, but you meant for him to die, and die he did. And then came Owen Hughes. At this name, Mrs. Price's composure finally broke. A sound escaped her lips, half sob, half moan, and she sank into the chair, her face buried in her hands. Owen Hughes was to tell Miss Archer something, Holmes said, something he had discovered. Perhaps the torn apron, perhaps the missing cyanide, perhaps he had seen you at the cottage. He went there to verify his suspicions, and you followed. I found beeswax and soot upon the ladder, the mark of something carried from the house, perhaps a candlestick you used to light your way. In the darkness of that loft, with Hughes bent over the very spot where Pritchard had died, you took hold of him, Perhaps you meant only to stop him from speaking, to plead or threaten. But the ladder is steep, the loft is high, and in the struggle he fell. His neck broke instantly. The second accidental death in 3 days, and who in the village would doubt that the curse had claimed another victim? Dr. Vaughan had risen, his face a mask of horror, and, I thought, shame. "I should have seen," he said hoarsely. "The almonds, I did smell them, Mr. Holmes, but I told myself it was imagination, that I was overtired, that the circumstances were too gothic to be real. God forgive me. I was blind." "You were willfully blind," Holmes corrected, though not without sympathy. "You did not wish to see murder where you expected only natural death. It is the common failing of good men in evil circumstances. But you will answer to your college for that blindness, Doctor. I have already written to them." He turned back to Mrs. Price, who had raised her head, and now sat with a terrible dignity, her work-worn hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though her face was the colour of old paper. "It was for my boy," she said. "My son, not my brother. My son, born before I married, raised by my sister as her own. The Colonel would not help him. He had debts, gambling, drinking, all the sins of weak men. The Colonel called him a wastrel and refused to advance another penny. Said he would rather see the money go to the village school than to throw it after a bad debt. He was going to change his will, cut out even the small bequest he had promised me for my years of service. Everything to Miss Margaret, who is good and kind, but who has her own life to live, and would not have needed my boy as I did." Miss Archer made a small sound of the protest, but Mrs. Price shook her head. "I do not blame you, miss. You have been nothing but kind. But a mother's love is not kind. It is fierce and foolish and blind to everything but its object. I thought—" She stopped, and the brief dream broke upon her face like a wave upon rocks. "I thought if I could make the Colonel seal the codicil, just one paper, just enough to provide for my boy. And then, if he were gone, before he could change his mind again." "But you made errors," Holmes said quietly. "You sealed with a thimble rather than his ring. You burned the paper when you should have hidden it. You summoned the sin-eater by name, when chance summoners never know their names. And most damningly, you killed again, when you should have stopped." "I didn't mean to harm Reese Pritchard," Mrs. Price said, and tears began to course down her weathered cheeks. "He was a good man once, before the drink took him. He came back the next morning, said he had seen something odd about the master's hand. A tremor, he said, that looked wrong for heart failure. He wanted more money to keep quiet. I was frightened. I gave him the cup and told him it was good whiskey I'd been saving. He drank it like water, poor fool. I watched him die, and I felt nothing. Nothing, Mr. Holmes. That is when I knew I was damned." "And Owen Hughes?" Holmes asked, though we all knew the answer. "He found the tin in my room," she whispered. I had hidden it poorly, being so distraught. He said nothing to me, but I saw in his eyes that he knew. He went to the cottage to see where Pritchard had died, to understand it. I followed. I only meant to explain, to beg him to say nothing. But he turned, there at the top of the ladder, and he looked at me with such horror, such judgment. I took hold of him, only to stop him from descending, to make him listen. But he pulled away, and he was gone. I heard him fall. I heard him die. And then I came back to the house, and I made breakfast, and I pretended that my world had not ended. She bowed her head then. not as one who pleads for mercy, but as one who has surrendered to the inevitable. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Miss Archer's quiet weeping and the eternal ticking of the clock. Holmes rang the bell, not by the string pulled from a stable door, but by the simple, upright act of a man summoning the law. The servants came, and with them the constable from the village, a solid man who had seen much in his years, but nothing quite like this. There was nothing theatrical in what followed, only the sound of a life folding shut, of justice being done in quiet voices and official words. We stepped out under the yews as Mrs. Price was led away, breathing air that bit like steel and carried the faint smell of frost and moorland. The ravens on the highest branch watched us with round, indifferent eyes, and I thought of all the deaths they must have witnessed over the years, perched upon their ancient trees. I have never liked their kind, with their black feathers and their knowing gaze, as if they see more than mortal eyes should see. Chapter 5. The Inquest of Candles. In the days that followed, the coroner sat in the inn parlour and took down, with small pained sighs and much scratching of pen upon paper, the testimony that made of a legend a ledger. The village came to hear, standing in the cold outside and speaking in hushed voices of curses and justice, of old ways and new truths. Mrs. Price stood in the dock with that same terrible dignity, answering questions in a voice that never faltered, though her eyes were those of one who has looked into the abyss and found it looking back. The jury needed little time. Murder, they said. 3 counts. And though she had confessed, though she had shown remorse, the law knows only guilt and innocence, not the gradations of human weakness that lie between. She was remanded to await trial, and we learned later that she died in prison before she could be brought before the assizes. Died, the doctor said, of a heart that simply gave up beating, as if she had willed herself into that darkness she knew awaited her. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street by the afternoon train, the countryside passing our windows in shades of brown and grey, the winter fields sleeping under a pale sky. London received us with that brusque acceptance which is the nearest thing she offers to affection. The roar of traffic, the cry of vendors, the smell of coal smoke and river damp that speaks of civilization in all its sprawling, indifferent vitality. It was 2 evenings later, as I sat in my chair attempting to set these strange events into some coherent narrative, that Holmes, who had been at his chemicals again with that absorption that could shut out the world for hours, reached with his pipette and let fall a single colourless drop upon the rim of the clay cup we had brought away with us by permission of the constable. The faintest blue halo bloomed and died, beautiful and terrible in its certainty. "Horsley's reagent," he said, setting down the pipette with the care one gives to dangerous things. "Even the ghost of cyanide consents to a dance when the fiddler's right. The cup retains its poison like memory, invisible to the careless eye, but unmistakable to those who know where to look and how to see." "You knew before we went," I said, watching his profile against the firelight. "About Mrs. Price." "I suspected," he returned, settling into his chair and reaching for his pipe. "The soot and wax told me a paper had been sealed and burned in haste, not the leisurely burning of correspondence, but the fierce, brief consumption of something that must be destroyed. Only a woman of the house would seal with a thimble, lacking access to the colonel's ring." The blue thread upon the stable nail matched her apron. I verified that immediately. The stain on her finger, no scullery lie, makes that particular brown, Watson. It is the mark of crushed digitalis, which country women use for heart complaints, and which, in sufficient quantity, stops the heart entirely. He drew upon his pipe, the smoke rising in lazy spirals towards the ceiling. The superstition was a cloak, cleverly chosen. When men fear a curse, they do not smell a cup, or question timing, or look for threads upon nails. They see what they expect to see. Ancient evil, supernatural vengeance, the sins of fathers visited upon sons. Mrs. Price understood her village, understood its beliefs, and used them with a ruthlessness born of desperation. "And yet you showed her mercy in your account," I observed. "You did not press the matter of the forged codicil as hard as you might have." Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight I seldom heard in it. "She might have been a good woman in another weather, Watson. Given different circumstances, a son not bent toward dissolution, a master more generous or more flexible, she might have lived and died, having harmed no one. But circumstances are the crucible in which character is tested, and she failed that test. 3 men died because she could not let go of a dream, could not accept that her son must face the consequences of his own choices. That is tragedy, Watson, not the melodrama of curses and sin-eaters, but the simple, terrible truth that love itself can become monstrous when it knows no bounds. I thought of Mrs. Price as I had last seen her, standing in that country courtroom with her grey hair neat beneath her bonnet, her hands folded, her eyes already looking beyond this world to whatever judgment awaited her beyond it. There had been no pleading, no theatrical displays of remorse, only the exhausted dignity of one who has done what she believed she must, and will now pay what she knows she owes. "Will you give the doctor to his college?" I asked, for this had troubled me. The thought of a man's career destroyed for the sin of not wishing to see evil where he expected none. "His own conscience will do more with him than the college," Holmes answered, though his voice carried no comfort in it. "But yes, I have written to them. Blindness in a physician is not a vice, Watson. It is a catastrophe. How many other deaths might he have attributed to natural causes when a keener eye would have seen murder? How many criminals walk free because a doctor signed a certificate without asking the questions that should have been asked? He may keep his practice, but he will do so, knowing that 3 men died, in part because he chose comfort over truth." We sat then for a while in companionable silence, each with his own thoughts. The fire crackled and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Beyond our windows, London breathed and muttered to itself, the eternal city, indifferent to our small dramas, absorbing our stories into its vast anonymous history. The case had none of those extravagances which made other of our adventures a delight to the popular press. No ancient treasures, no masked villains, no chases through midnight streets or dramatic revelations in public places. Yet I found in it a certain austere poetry. A house taken captive by a rite meant to ease the dead and exploited to murder the living. A woman who borrowed the mask of an ancient penance to hide a modern crime. A village whose superstitions became the instrument of its own deception. And a man whose nose for almonds was less keen than the village's nose for supernatural smoke. The sin-eater's house stood empty now, I learned later. No one would rent it, though Miss Archer offered it at a generous rate. The villagers said it was cursed, truly cursed this time, not by ancient sins, but by modern ones, by the blood of 3 men, and the desperation of a woman who loved not wisely, but too well. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps some places do absorb the evil done within them, holding it in their stones and timbers like the cyanide held in that clay cup, invisible to careless eyes, but there nonetheless for those who know how to look. Miss Archer wrote to us some months later, a brief note thanking Holmes for his services and informing us that she had endowed a scholarship in her uncle's name for the children of the village. She had also, she said, personally paid off the debts of Mrs. Price's son on the condition that he leave England and make a new start in the colonies. It was, she wrote, what her uncle would have wanted, not the murder, God knew, but the mercy afterward. Holmes read the letter, nodded once, and filed it away without comment, though I saw the faint smile that touched his lips. Justice and mercy walk different paths, but sometimes, if we are fortunate, they meet at the end. I set down these reflections to close the account, as I have done with so many other cases, in the hope that where I have failed in precision or deductive clarity, my reader may at least find a species of human truth. For this was not merely a puzzle to be solved, or a criminal to be caught. It was a window into those dark territories of the heart, where love and desperation meet and produce not light, but shadow. Holmes, having coaxed a little ascending music from his violin, some melancholy air that might have been Beethoven or his own composition, lowered the bow and looked across at me with that dry, affectionate mischief which I have never been able to reproduce adequately upon the page, though I have tried in a dozen accounts. "My dear Watson," said he, and his eyes held that glint of humour that could lighten even the darkest cases. "If ever I die in my chair, and you are tempted to lay bread and salt upon me, pray only that the villain of the piece has a poor head for chemistry. I should hate to think my last cordial was anything other than excellent brandy, properly aged and honestly poured." I laughed in spite of myself, in spite of the weight of the case still upon my mind, in spite of the memory of Mrs. Price's grey face in that country courtroom. The laughter felt like absolution, or perhaps merely like return, the return to Baker Street, to gaslight and tobacco smoke, to the comfortable tyranny of routine and the certainty that however dark the case, Holmes would find the light to see by. The fog beyond our window pressed its flat face to the pane like a curious Londoner at a show, and somewhere in the city a clock struck 10. The fire made its small, contented noises, settling into ash and ember. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new puzzles, new opportunities for Holmes to exercise that extraordinary mind of his. But tonight we sat in silence, 2 old soldiers of the truth, veterans of a campaign against darkness that would never truly end, but which we would wage nonetheless, case by case, clue by clue, until we ourselves passed beyond the reach of mortal mystery. The case of the Sin-Eater's house passed, as all things must, into the comfortable tyranny of memory. But I have recorded it here, as faithfully as I am able, so that others may read and judge and perhaps understand that the line between good and evil is not always clear, that love itself can become poison, and that sometimes the greatest crimes are committed not in hatred but in devotion, which makes them no less terrible, and perhaps all the more tragic. The lamp burned low. Holmes set aside his violin and reached for his well-worn volume of medieval poetry. I returned to my notes, adding final touches to this account. And London breathed on around us, ancient and indifferent, holding its million stories close, while we two sat in our small circle of light and warmth, grateful for reason in an unreasonable world, for friendship in a friendless city, and for the knowledge that however deep the darkness, truth remains truth and will out at last. Thus ends the account of the Sin Eater's house,